Inspectors. Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman. Inspector Horowitz, in your report and now in your testimony, you said that you are deeply troubled and very concerned that the anti-Trump bias reflected in the struck page text messages was so great as to have possibly impacted Peter Strzok's conduct in the Wiener laptop part of the Hillary Clinton investigation. Is that fair?
Correct.
So if the Department of Justice and the FBI's own Inspector General is very concerned and deeply troubled about Peter Strzok's anti-Trump bias affecting his actions as an FBI agent, is it unreasonable for President Trump, as the subject of an investigation, to likewise be very concerned and deeply troubled that Mr. Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation?
I'm going to step back on that, Congressman, and speak to the broader point that that's precisely why we were concerned, generally speaking, about the election review, that those kind of messages create that appearance of bias that undercuts credibility and the ability to do investigation. I can't speak to
Right. Well, I'm not asking you to make any findings about the Trump-Russia matter. I'm asking you about the people that you investigated in your report, people whose actions you found so deeply troubling and very concerning. I just want to find out if you think it's unreasonable for the President to feel the same way you do.
My concern on that is, as you know, we're currently reviewing that, and I want to be careful. I don't want to be myself seen as prejudging any outcomes here. So I'm going to let folks draw what reasonable inferences they want to draw from this, but I don't want to be seen as making any judgments on that.
Well, do you think it's unreasonable for President Trump to be very concerned or deeply troubled, as you were, that 8 days after Peter Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation, that he promised another FBI employee, Lisa Page, that Trump would never be president because he'd stop it?
I think any individual in this country should be concerned about that kind of language.
And the reason you're concerned about that, Inspector General, I think, is because you said numerous times here that Strzok's stated bias and stated willingness to act on that bias are antithetical to the core values of the FBI, correct? Another thing that's antithetical to the FBI and the Department of Justice and our entire justice system is putting people in charge of investigating people they hate, of people that they are biased against and that they are prejudiced against, right?
Correct.
And we don't do that in our justice system. We can't do that in our justice system, a system where the bedrock principle has to be the fair and impartial administration of justice free from bias and prejudice, right?
Correct.
So I think the point that you're making and that I agree with is that anyone, you, me, any member of Congress, any American who becomes the subject of an investigation should not be investigated by people who have sent hundreds of hateful text messages about them before the investigation ever began and then continued to send them while the investigation was occurring. That is by definition prejudicial to the fair and impartial administration of justice, isn't it?
I think that is precisely the concern.
And yet that is exactly what happened to President Trump. Now, to your credit, Inspector Horowitz, you revealed the astonishing level, the outrageous level of bias and prejudice, and when you did, Special Counsel Mueller removed Peter Strzok from the case. But you and I are former prosecutors, and you and I both know that it is impossible to remove bias and prejudice from all of the actions taken, all of the decisions made, all of the investigative plans implemented, all of the evidence gathered by Peter Strzok and at least 2 other Trump-hating FBI agents and lawyers who were assigned to the investigation. That's pretty hard to do, isn't it?
Well, that is precisely the question, as you know, we're looking at.
So my colleagues over there just keep pointing out that your report doesn't state any conclusions about the Trump-Russia investigation. And they're right. The report doesn't state any conclusions. But your findings of fact about the people in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation in the case of Peter Strzok for 9 months, the person in charge of the investigation, well, that leads to all sorts of undeniable conclusions about pervasive bias and prejudice against President Trump by the people who never, ever should have been in charge of gathering evidence against him. Let me switch topics in the remaining 20 seconds that I have. Did Jim Comey make the decision not to prosecute Hillary Clinton before or after her July 2nd, 2016 interview?
I'm going to let you answer the question, even though the gentleman from Texas grossly misjudged the amount of time he does not have left anymore. It's actually 20 seconds over rather than under, but you can answer the question.
As we laid out here and described here, prior to the July 2nd interview, absent, as we were told, either a confession or a false statements, the decision had been made to close the investigation.
So the fact that Director Comey testified under oath to members of Congress in response to a question about whether or not the decision was made before or after, unequivocally stated after, do you think it's reasonable for members of Congress to think that they were misled by that answer?
I'd probably have to look at the transcript. As you know, so much of that turns on the precise question and answer. So
can I take that as a promise to look at that?
I'll take a look at the question and answer, and then we can talk further, Congressman, about that.
Thank you, Inspector Horowitz. Appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.